I think it's extremely important to stare some realities in the face in this conversation. At the beginning of this war, we were told that economic sanctions would bring Russia's economy to its knees. I remember the Wall Street Journal promising 8 on the Richter scale of sanctions. I never believed that. And it's turned out to be quite wrong. We also need to recognize that the United States is no longer assisting Ukraine. And I encounter people at this conference who don't appear to have grasped that reality. Deliveries, financial aid have ceased. Anything that comes from the United States from this point on will have to be paid for. That means that this war is now Europe's war. And that pits Europe against not only Russia, but also China. And this is where I must disagree with you, with all due respect. Russia is not losing the war in Ukraine if it has the backing of China, because China is by far the largest manufacturing power in the world. It has double the manufacturing value added of the United States and dwarfs that of Europe. Even without China, here's a fact that I learned from Moritz Schulerich's excellent Kiel Institute. Russian military spending is almost the same as that of EU and UK measured in purchasing power parity terms. These facts should sober us all of us who wish for a Ukrainian victory. Let me go on. Far from having its economy crippled by sanctions, Russia has had its economy stimulated by war to an extent that is almost a textbook example of how a war economy works. Let me give you some more bold facts. Since the fourth quarter of 2022, Russia's output of Lancet drones has risen by 260%. The same applies to its production of tanks. Its short-range air defense systems output has risen at 233%. For infantry fighting vehicles, it's up 180%. For artillery, up 180%. And that was from a base of stocks far higher than that, not just of Ukraine, but of Europe. Moreover, Europe's intended additional procurement, since the great and much vaunted announcements of rearmament earlier this year, are a rounding error in quantitative terms compared with this scale of increased production. Now, Gillian, you mentioned the faint hope that I encounter regularly that Russia's economy will oblige us by entering a crisis. This is wishful non-thinking. You can find evidence of overheating and distress in the kind of sectors that you'd expect to find distressed in a war economy. Residential real estate, for example. There has been an increase in non-performing loans. But anybody who thinks this is going to translate into an economic crisis is smoking some very strong substance. Let me just give you some more facts, sobering though they are. So Russian military spending has roughly doubled in the course of the war. It's north of 7% of GDP. Its deficit currently, or last year, stood at 2.4% of GDP, 2.5 rather. Its debt to GDP is a mere 14%. This puts it in a fiscally stronger position than I think just about every EU member state. A third of the state's revenues are from oil and gas, which it continues to sell on global markets through its shadow fleet, despite all talk of sanctions. The inflation rate is 8.7%. But get this, Russian real wages have risen 22% since the war began. Unemployment simply doesn't exist. Disposable income is up 48%. Retail sales are 28% up. Consumer sentiment in Russia today is at all-time highs. The sanctions regime has failed utterly, partly because no one was serious on either side of the Atlantic about cutting off revenues to Russia from its exports of fossil fuels, but also because of a massive hypocrisy by European states that have continued to export to Russia via third countries. I can assure you, Europe's trade with Kyrgyzstan did not quadruple because Kyrgyzstan is going through an economic boom. So we need to live in the real world, a real world in which Russia has in fact proved quite successful, as we heard this morning at breakfast. For example, it's scaling up drone production in a way that Europe is not able to match. And now that this project of supporting Ukraine is essentially a EU project, the most urgent thing that we need to discuss is how can Europe possibly match the current scale of armaments production on the other side? Because if it fails to compensate for the fact that the US is no longer a source of aid to Ukraine, then I'm afraid ultimately it's very hard for me as a historian to see another outcome of this conflict than yet another case where Russia, wasting the lives of Russian men and boys on a scale that is stunning to behold, nevertheless grinds out a victory. That is the nightmare scenario that we need to stare in the face on the basis of simple economics. That is currently the higher probability scenario, much higher probability scenario than Russian collapse.